Hello, my name is Tamal Pilla with the Center for Presidential History at SMU, joined today by Dr. Fritz Bartel. Dr. Bartel is an assistant professor in the Department of International Affairs at Texas A&M University. His interests lie in U.S. foreign relations, the global Cold War, grand strategy, and the history of capitalism. He will be joining us on February 19th to discuss his book and the 2023 CPH Book Prize winner, The Triumph of Broken Promises, the End of the Cold War, and the Rise of Neoliberalism. Dr. Bartel, thanks for joining me.
Thanks so much, Tamal, for having me. Looking forward to the event.
Yeah. I want to kind of get right into it. I won't make you make any generalizing claims about the arguments in the book. I think that's why you wrote a book about it, right? And that's why people should come out to your talk in February. But I want to take this moment to ask you about something that I'm curious about, which was something that you talk about in the first chapter of the book. And that's the Eastern Bloc, these state socialist governments racking on tons and tons of debt. And these bankers being pretty comfortable making these loans. Why is that? Why were these bankers so comfortable handing out all of these billions of dollars? I saw that cool chart, billions of dollars on credit to these socialist governments.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's actually the one that got me first interested in this project. I couldn't figure out, what I knew of the Cold War, I didn't even know that the capitalist and communist worlds were so financially and economically intertwined. And so once I heard that the Eastern Bloc was $90 billion in debt when the Berlin Wall came down, that was kind of the fact that I thought I need to figure out more about this. And so that's one of the things I'll talk about, obviously, as you said, in the talk in February. But what I discovered when I started to dig into this topic was that, ironically, given what we now know about state socialist governments and how they ended up collapsing, in the 1970s, when this debt really took off, state socialist governments actually looked like some of the most stable governments in the entire world. And they looked like they were, in a sense, immune from the economic crises that were bedeviling the Western world at that exact same time. So if you were a Western capitalist banker in, let's say, 1973, 74, 75, and you're sitting on an enormous pile of capital that has flowed into your coffers because of the first oil shock of 1973, which is where the book really starts. Ironically, you ended up looking to places like communist Poland or communist Hungary or the Soviet Union itself, and thinking that's a place that I should put my money. As I said, it was partially because they were perceived to be very stable governments. They were, of course, authoritarian governments. And so if you're a banker, and this is kind of goes to the realism at the heart of the book, or in a way, the cynicism at the heart of the book, and you're thinking about the day when these loans have to be repaid, you think that authoritarianism is something that's actually an asset, because what good is authoritarianism for, except to turn the screws on the population if you ever need to. And so bankers thought that authoritarian governments would be the ones that would be most able to repay their loans if they ever ran into financial trouble. And it turned out over the course of the late 1970s and then the 1980s that authoritarianism actually proved quite costly and was a big impediment to repaying these loans, because populations really wanted, it turned out, history would show, some form of democratic legitimacy. Like, if you were going to ask people to sacrifice in order to repay loans, they wanted that sacrifice to be asked of them from a democratically legitimate government. And so that asset, quote unquote, asset of authoritarianism that first attracted Western bankers to the socialist world turned out to be one of the major reasons for the downfall of the communist world in the end.
Yeah. You mentioned the 1970s, and that is a huge pivotal moment. I say moment as if it's not a full decade, but pivotal series of events in your book, because you kind of talk, the Cold War began, and I'm kind of paraphrasing, as a race between democratic capitalists and state socialist governments, right? To promise their people a better life. But after the 70s, it actually pivoted. And this is kind of the crux of the title of your book. That promise shifts. The race transformed from a competition to expand social contracts into a competition to discipline them. And that's a sentence that at first glance I didn't really understand. Can you tell me a little bit more about what it means to discipline a social contract?
Yeah.
Economic discipline is a huge theme in the latter half of your book. I'd love to hear what you have to say on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So it depends on which place you're in, right? So, and the book covers both Western democratic capitalist countries and state socialist countries, as you said. And really, this social contract, which is, of course, this language that academics and philosophers have used for a long time to talk about the kind of informal agreements or set of expectations that populations maintain with their governments to exchange in a way, granting a government legitimacy in exchange for something else, right? And people talk about input and output legitimacy. So you deem your government to be legitimate based on the like how that government comes to be, whether it's elections or something else. Or you can think about it in terms of output legitimacy, what you get from the government in return. And so the way I set up the book and how I think about the Cold War, right, often it's thought of as, and it's not wrong to say that it is a security competition or a military competition between the two blocs. But it's also an ideological competition and really a competition over two ways of life, right? As I call it, two sets of promises, where capitalism and communism were promising their people a different version of what you might think of as the good life, right? Capitalism was going to give you individual freedom, mass consumption, right? But over time, an ever increasing standard of living. Communism, right, was in some ways diametrically opposed to that. It didn't grant personal freedom in the way that Americans would think about that, right? Certainly not political freedom, but it did grant greater economic equality and economic security for their populations, right? So your job security, right? For instance, one of the major claims that communist states could make to superiority over the capitalist world was that there was no unemployment within their societies, right? Everyone had a right to a job and could maintain that job security over the course of their lifetime. So you were, even though they couldn't match the prosperity of Western countries, they could in a way compensate for that or make up for that with a different set of promises, largely based on kind of greater economic equality and greater economic security. That, as you said, the crises of the 1970s, where the book really takes off, the kind of leading premise of the book, the first thing I'm saying is that race to make promises that started the Cold War becomes untenable. And both sides, due to pressures from the global economy of various kinds, end up having to turn around to their populations at certain moments and say, those promises that we previously made, those are no longer sustainable, right? And so they turn around and they break promises or they impose economic discipline. So if you're in a place like communist Poland, which comes up a lot, or in the Soviet Union, one of the major promises that they start to try to break is to have prices that they promised would forever be kind of stable, right, and at a very low level. They start to increase the price of goods over and over again to try to compensate for the fact that they don't have the resources that they used to have. Well, in the Eastern Bloc, that's a very political act, and so these price increases often result in major political upheaval that in the end actually produces the revolutions of 1989. And so the book tries to trace those moments of economic discipline, the times where governments, in contrast to what they usually do, which is make promises and try to fulfill those promises, it traces the moments where they had to turn around to their populations and say, actually, we have to break the promises. We have to impose this kind of economic discipline. And so those moments in the United States came primarily through the recession of the late 1970s, early 1980s, which is often now just referred to as the Volcker shock after Paul Volcker, the chairman of the Federal Reserve. Right, he puts millions of Americans out of work. He causes the greatest recession in post-war history up to that point. Subsequently, the Great Recession of 2008 has made it bigger, but up to that time, it was truly unprecedented in the post-war period. And he's doing all of this to tackle the problem of inflation, one that we know well in the current day. He's able to do that, and basically, when the similar kinds of problems arise in the Eastern Bloc, communist governments aren't able to do the same thing. And their struggles with those problems is what I argue in the book ultimately results in the end of the Cold War. So that's what I'll be talking about.
I want to transition now into talking about the process of writing this book. Correct me if I'm wrong. This started as a dissertation, right? Okay.
That's right. Yeah.
So at what point did you decide that this was something that you were going to turn into a publishable work? And did you have a target audience in mind? Was it just something to do? I mean, tell me, walk me through that. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. So, well, you can ask many authors, and they probably have many moments when they think, I don't really want to turn this into a book. They like there's the moments of doubt and struggle are always there. But no, I think the hope was always to turn this into a book. One of the things when you write a dissertation, that initially, sometimes I joke, right? You talked about the intended audience, right? The intended audience for a dissertation is 4 people, the people on your committee. And then when you write a book, you hope to increase that audience to 10 people. But there's going to be more than 10 people there in February, so the audience will already be bigger than that.
There you go.
So no, it took about 4 or 5 years to take it from a dissertation and turn it into a book. And I've been very fortunate, actually, that it's found an audience that is both kind of traditional academic historians, which is the primary audience for a first book, and also many, many people who are just looking for a different understanding of the Cold War and the end of the Cold War in particular than what they had come to know, right? So Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev are right there on the cover, and they are central parts of this book, and the kind of traditional things that we think about when we think of the end of the Cold War, if it's arms control agreements or Reagan standing there at the Berlin Wall and saying, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." Right? These are all, or the fall of the Berlin Wall itself. These are all central parts of the book. But I try to, and hopefully I succeed at kind of placing all of these traditional markers of the Cold War in a different light by looking at the economic forces that are surrounding them, and through doing that, hopefully also give us a better understanding of how economic forces continue to influence geopolitics and domestic politics up to the present day.
Yeah. Not really a question, just a comment. I would tend to agree. Especially in my schooling, Reagan and Gorbachev are obviously big names in this ending of the Cold War tale.
Right.
Very rarely do you hear stories about Poland or Hungary, and those are stories that I briefly read about in your book, which I really enjoyed, by the way. Last thing I want to leave you with is a question that I ask just about every author, because we're the Center for Presidential History. So if there are going to be students coming out, it's going to be humanities students, history, English, philosophy, things of the sort. What would you say to maybe an engineering student or a vocal performance major, who might be in the area, has nothing to do, and is on the fence about attending your lecture on February 19th? What would you say to them? What would you say to convince them, hey, this might be worth your while?
Yeah, well, I'd say, the semester's not too old yet, so you've got some extra time hanging around. The papers are not coming due yet, hopefully. But no, then I'd say, if you want to kind of give this event a shot and give my talk a shot, I think what it will offer you is a different lens for thinking about the world in which you inhabit, right? So the 3 central forces that I focus on in the book are finance, energy or oil and gas, and then this idea of economic discipline. All 3 of these remain central to how Americans live today, right? What conflicts are about overseas, how they're resolved. So if you think about the war in Ukraine, for instance, right? what did the United States do in response to Russian aggression in Ukraine? We put sanctions on them, right? We used the tools of finance. We tried to control the export of Russian energy, right? And we've then, because it caused an inflationary crisis, or it perpetuated, it made worse an inflationary crisis within the United States, we've then had to turn to the tools of, you might think of economic discipline, right? We're raising interest rates dramatically over the last year and a half to try to deal with the same problem that people had in the 1970s, inflation, right? So in a way, the history that's there in my book are the same forces that we continue to think about today. And one of the things that the book tries to do, of course, is connect these economic forces to political outcomes that had happened in the 1970s and 1980s. And I don't think there's any question, although we can't foresee exactly how, there's no question that these economic forces will also have political effects today. So whether you're thinking about the upcoming presidential election in the fall, whether you're thinking about Israel, Gaza, whether you're thinking about Russia, Ukraine, Taiwan, and China, right? Whatever the kind of geopolitical or domestic political issues that are most important to you, they probably have some sort of connection to finance, energy, and economic discipline. Once I started looking at those three things, it looked like everything had some kind of connection to those things. So that's what we'll try to explore in February.
Sweet. All right, good deal. I love it. Well, Dr. Bartel, thanks for taking the time. I appreciate you having this super quick conversation with me. I hope it's encouraged a few of those art students to come out to your talk on, for a reminder, February 19th, 6 p.m., McCourt Auditorium. Thank you again.
Thanks so much. Looking forward to it.